Hello everyone, we're going to begin now. Welcome to LD at School's third webinar. Funding for the production of this publication was provided by the Ministry of Education. Please note that the views expressed in the publication are the views of the recipient and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education. We're very excited to welcome our guest speakers, Dr. Todd Cunningham and Dr.Rhonda Martinussen, who will be speaking to us this afternoon about IEP development and implementation, considering the student, the environment, and the academic domain. Just to let everyone know, all webinar participants, except for the presenters, have been muted for the remainder of the presentation. Although, once Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Martinussen have finished the presentation, we will be opening up the floor for questions. Before we get started, I'm going to help everyone acquaint themselves with the GoToWebinar control panel. If you don't see the full panel, you should see an arrow, which you can click on to maximize the panel. The same button will minimize the panel during the presentation. Over the course of the presentation, if you would like to ask any of the staff a question, you may enter your text in the box at the bottom of the control panel and choose to send it to the staff from the drop-down menu underneath. Finally, the hand raise button can be used to ask Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Martinussen a question at the end of their talk. If you raise your hand, you will be unmuted so that you may personally ask the presenters your question. After the webinar, we will be sending out presentation slides, as well as a link for a survey to let us know how you feel the webinar went. In approximately 2 weeks, the webinar recording will be available and we will send out a link to all participants. All right, that takes care of all our housekeeping. Let's get started. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Todd Cunningham. With his engaging presentation style, weaving together research, compelling stories, and humor, Dr. Cunningham has empowered thousands of educators to support students who learn differently in their classrooms. Dr. Cunningham is a psychologist, supervised practice, currently teaching at the University of Toronto, and provides academic intervention services. He completed his Postdoctoral Fellowship in the Psychology Department at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto and obtained his Ph.D. in Clinical Psychology at the University of Toronto. His innovative research investigates the integration of assistive technology and learning strategies for children with learning difficulties due to a variety of reasons. A sought-after public speaker and consultant, Dr. Cunningham has shared his expertise with parents, students, educators, school boards, and other professionals across Canada. In addition to hundreds of workshops, Dr. Cunningham has guest lectured at universities, given keynote addresses, presented at educational and research conferences, and appeared on CBC several times. Dr. Cunningham was recently awarded a Bell Let's Talk mental health grant to provide academic intervention support to Northern Ontario communities through telepsychology. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Rhonda Martinussen. Dr. Martinussen is currently an Associate Professor of Special Education and Adaptive Instruction at the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. She is interested in the nature of the overlap between inattention and learning difficulties in children and adolescents. She is currently conducting research on oral language proficiency and reading comprehension in youth with and without attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. She is also highly interested in teacher professional development and teacher preparation in the fields of special education and literacy instruction. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to them.
Well, thank you very much for having us here today. And so really what we want to do is not talk about how to write IEPs, but really talk about some of the big things, some of the, sorry about that, there we go. Talk about some of the things that we're finding or thinking about in when actually developing some of the big questions that are often looming or that we often get about on what we need to be thinking about in putting into that IEP.
So today's agenda includes a basic introduction to the Individualized Education Plan. So what is it? Then we'll go through and talk about how important learning profiles are to this implementation of an IEP and how teachers can use an IEP as a tool to promote learning, curriculum access, and achievement in students with a learning disability. We'll talk about the various parts of the IEP and how they should connect to each other. And we'll refocus on understanding the child's needs again, but then link that into to specific areas of accommodation, so instructional, environmental, and assessment. Then we'll have a short chat about some of the common issues that come up with accommodations, and we'll discuss some of these in terms of the research that's been done. And near the end, we're going to talk about modifications in terms of, when do you implement a modified program, what would it look like for a student with an LD, and then we'll provide some characteristics of effective interventions for students with LD in that context, and then wrap it all up in the end.
Yeah. So again, we are talking about individuals with a learning disability, so we're really going to focus on this population. And as you know, as we talked about several weeks ago in the talking about psychoeducational assessment, is the definition for learning disability used by the LDAO is one that shows that an individual has to have the ability to learn. So that means that they have at least average to above average intelligence. However, there's a cognitive weakness, or the way that their brain is wired, it's making it hard for them to either take information in, to remember it, understand it, or express that information. So processing that information in a certain way. And a learning disability can impact more than just school. It's something that impacts friendships, work, it impacts self-esteem in daily living. So it's not just a school-related disorder. However, over the last 50 years of research that we've been gathering, we do know that when provided with the right type of strategies and interventions, that these individuals are able to succeed. And so when we look at the IEP process then, the IEP is really a living document. It's a document that should be continuously being updated based on how a child is developing and based on what the new demands are them within the school system, in the classroom. And what we see in terms of that IEP development, as the Education for All document talked about, is that often it starts with just classroom teachers observing students within the classroom, seeing what their challenges are, seeing the things that they're good at, trying to start to address some of those challenges, and when some of those challenges are not being able to address, really going to the broader school community, usually through an in-school team meeting, to get some additional input. And the IEP just becomes that formal document then that's really beginning to track what are the things that we are doing that is able to help that student when we've identified some specific weaknesses. And the data that can go into the IEP to kind of help understand that student are from both the classroom teacher, can be from parents, can be from the student, as well as other assessment avenues such as psychoeducational assessment, speech and language, OT, and so on. And as we're bringing this information together, really what's being developed is kind of the learning profile for that student. We're understanding first kind of the cognitive areas, how is their brain processing the information, social emotional, how are they feeling, but more specifically, and the area that really the IEP focuses in on is these main domains, the academic skills. Reading, writing, math, being able to be organized in classroom, taking notes, and also motor output. And when we look at these academic skills, it's never just good enough to say a person has a reading problem. We have to really break it down. We have to take that kind of broad category and break it down to the individual skills that build up that category. So if we say a person has a reading difficulty, well, what's the difficulty? Are they unable to decode individual words? Do they not recognize words as a unit? When they read, do they read disfluently? So are they slow and choppy? And do they even understand what they're reading? So we have to really break down these different constructs into their individual units. Because then, once we have those individual units, once we know what the specific academic skill or that weakness is, then we really can start to find things that are going to be able to help that individual out. And when you have an academic weakness, really, again, lots of research kind of talks about this, is that the best way to support that weakness is through the zone of proximal development. And more important, when we're supporting a student in general, we really have to think about the zone of proximal development, because the key in many cases for a student to be in the classroom is so that they can access the regular curriculum, so that they can do the same work that their peers are doing. However, for students who have learning disabilities, often what happens is due to a specific academic skill weakness, due to the fact they might not be able to decode words, or they're a bad speller, or they don't know the times table, due to one of these specific skill deficits, then that impedes their ability to do work that other students are able to do. So for example, if we had a grade 4 class and the students were sitting around and they were all asked to have to read some passages out loud, if a student who has a reading disability was sitting in that class, then the ability to ask them to read out loud, well, that's going to be too challenging for them. Because they are unable to read those individual words, the challenge is too great to be able to participate in that group activity. And so therefore, that's going to cause a lot of anxiety in that student. They're going to have a lot of anxiety. On the other hand, if that grade 4 student, if the only thing they ever had to read was grade 2 literature, and then they kind of progressed from grade 4 to grade 5 to grade 6 to grade 7, and they're still just being given grade 2 literature because that's kind of where their reading ability is, then that's also going to create a lot of boredom in the students. And we know if students feel bored or if students feel very anxious, then they're more likely to exit the school system over time. So the idea then is to really figure out how do we control for the level of challenge appropriately so that we keep students in that zone of proximal development so that they are able to learn the same things that their peers are able to learn, to participate in the regular curriculum.
So one model that has been described in many of the ministry documents, including Learning for All, is that there's the broad principle of universal design for learning. And that principle basically sets the stage for teachers to consider how the classroom, the lessons, the activities are designed so that barriers to learning are removed from the get-go. So, for example, if you have a ramp to enter a building, it's actually very useful for many people. So instead of designing a lesson and then afterwards having to retrofit it, you think ahead and plan the lesson so that you're taking into account the strengths of the students as well as addressing some of those barriers. Another approach, which is probably known in Ontario as a tiered approach and is often studied in the literature as a response intervention approach, is one in which the teacher is using a formative assessment to determine whether the instruction that's been provided to a student or a group of students is working. And if there is no progress on the target outcome, then there's reconsideration to say, well, maybe I have to change something. What does this need? What does this student need to be successful? And along with that is differentiated instruction, in which the classroom teacher, again, it's very much connected to UDL, is taking a look at how you may be able to differentiate the process of teaching, the product that the student is developing to show knowledge or success in an area, and differentiation along those various domains helps students, again, access the curriculum and show what they know. The evidence-based interventions are more targeted interventions that could include remediation or compensatory practices, and sometimes, in fact, many students can benefit from both. So remediation would be, for example, direct instruction in how to engage in decoding strategies to boost word recognition, accuracy, and fluency, whereas a compensatory strategy would be a strategy that's used to help the student bypass or get around or not have that learning need as a barrier. And in many cases, those would be listed under the broader context of accommodations, but they may also include other well-related assistive technology that also can provide a bypass strategy.
Mm-hmm. And often what we see is the kind of top two levels here are things that are done more at the classroom base, where it's the evidence base is really that targeting into that specific student. And so then the IEP really kind of addressing that bottom level is taking kind of the student's profile. What is that? What are their academic strengths and challenges? Listing kind of the things that are needed to support that student, so that the classroom teacher then can take those ideas and be able to implement them within the regular classroom. Now, we don't talk about remediation and compensatory within the IEP. The way that the IEP talks about these areas is in the broader idea of accommodations and modifications, where accommodations are the things that we do to be able to bypass those areas of challenge. The student continues to meet the same curriculum expectations. And our accommodations falls into three different areas: the instruction, the environment, and through assessment.
And I think it's really important to emphasize that when you're making accommodations, and if that's the only thing that a student is receiving, they're working at the same exact curriculum expectations as their peers. Mm-hmm. It's just that in order to make sure that they can access them or show their knowledge, that the accommodation is being provided. So it might need more time if mm-hmm. it was an environmental accommodation to allow the student to process the task so that they can gather all the information.
Yeah. And often what we see is we see either lots of accommodations in IEPs or not enough. It's sometimes kind of tricky to figure out what is the level. And the resource guide, the IEP resource guide published in 2004 by the Ministry of Ed, is fantastic to really talk about the whole development and give kind of some lists of some very common accommodations. But one of the problems that I think we often hear from parents and from teachers is, yeah, it's great that we have this list of different accommodations here, but how does that actually translate into what I need to do in the classroom? Or how does my classroom teacher take that and be able to support my that student? Because things such as mind mapping or even time management, yes, they're great instructional accommodations, but how does that actually fit that individual student? And we'll talk more about that in a minute, about some of our ideas about how to go about doing that. On the other hand, then modification really is this idea of, in our mind, I think modification needs to not just be seen as kind of just lowering the expectations for a student, but really needs to be part of a remediation package. So in many cases, I think modification and remediation should go hand in hand. What we're doing through a modification is we're saying, okay, the student is unable to meet these current curriculum goals, so we need to kind of develop a very targeted remediation intervention that is going to hit those specific academic skill weaknesses that student's having, and then over a given time period, we should see change in that level. So a modification should not be something that a student has forever, especially for students with learning disabilities. A modification really should be brought in for a time period while we are specifically targeting a specific academic skill, so that at the end of that remediation time, or at the end of that modification time, and that skill level has developed sufficiently that now the student's better able to access the regular curriculum, and that modification can be dropped.
And I think it's particularly important when you're working with younger students, because we also know that students tend to respond to interventions or remediations more easily when they're younger. And so it's quite possible for that student to receive this instruction and catch up somewhat, and then at the same time receive accommodations to help them access the information. So for example, if they're struggling with decoding, recognizing words, and they're reading at a grade 2 level, but they're in grade 5, then you don't take away, you can provide grade 5, let's say, science content, but the accommodation would be permitting that student to access that content and bypass the decoding issue.
And so over time, I think, Rhonda, as you're saying, we see a change between the balances between modification and accommodations. Earlier on, modifications work better. We get more bang for our buck. And as the student increases, and we don't necessarily always have the sufficient amount of time, especially in secondary, to do modifications, and then really the accommodations come in. But they go together, and based on the individual student, where their development is kind of trying to figure out what that right package is.
And some students have alternative programs too, if their performance requires a significant shift in the secondary system.
Right. Yeah. So let's look at the instructional point areas of accommodations.
So instructional accommodations really are adjustments in how instruction is provided to enable the student to learn and to progress through the curriculum. And it's important to realize that much of the selection around the accommodation or the instructional strategy is looking at what does this child need to be successful. It really has to be focused. So for example, the questions that often come up, there's this long list of instructional accommodations. Do you use them all? If you select, the certain number, how do you implement them? Can you use them with other students? And essentially it comes down to what we think is a two-step implementation, if we're going to make it fairly concise.
Right.
The first one is you have to identify the accommodations that address the student's specific learning challenges. So if we think back to Todd's mind map there, it's really going deep down, because the accommodation, it might be, okay, it's the ability to take notes from the board is hampered by slow handwriting fluency, or it could be hampered by the ability to focus and receptive language to understand. So in that case, you would select an accommodation that would help that student with that particular challenge. And then the second piece, and we're kind of adapting this from Dr. Nancy Hutchinson's text. She talks about, looking at the demands of the classroom, and we felt it's very similar to thinking about tuning it. So you, as the student is progressing through the grades, both the developmental challenges change. So the expectations in grade 3 are not the same for grade 6 or grade 7 in terms of independent work and level of complexity. And so the accommodations constantly have to be tuned to fit, to help the student in the context that they're in. So the teacher's pedagogy may even be different from year to year depending on the type of instructional demands that are made, and also with the curriculum, how the curriculum is changing.
Yeah. So to give kind of a concrete example then, if we were saying, let's go back to our grade 4 student, our grade 4 student sitting in class, and we give him a worksheet to be able to do. Well, because of his learning profile, because decoding, word reading, and fluency are primary areas of weakness for him, some secondary around comprehension, then because of these weaknesses, it's going to hit a whole bunch of different domains, and that worksheet's going to become very problematic because they're not going to be able to read the worksheet. Or that we might be asking that individual to have to learn some work from reading a textbook at home. Or it might be a word problem that they're asked to do. And so this basic core academic skill weakness is going to impact a whole bunch of different things that we do within the classroom, being able to impair their learning. And then so we have some accommodations that can be able to help those. And some of the common accommodations to help out with some basic reading difficulties are like having a peer read to them, or having a computer read out loud, or having the text already recorded ahead of time, or providing the text ahead of time so that they can go home and use any of those accommodations or another accommodation to be able to ensure that they have access to that knowledge. So because of this basic academic skill weakness, then these tasks become very problematic for that student. They're not going to be necessarily able to learn from these or participate in these tasks. The level of challenge has suddenly become too great. And the idea then is using that accommodation, one of these accommodations, to kind of pull back on that level of challenge. So.
Right, and so here's just a, for example, if you're doing text-to-speech, I think a critical thing is that it also requires practice, and as Todd's own research has shown, you really have to think about the pacing and the speed at which the voice reads the text. So again, there's almost a tuning within the accommodation as well to make sure that each is working the way that it should, but also gaining feedback from the student, particularly with slightly older students. They can provide input into how well this is working or what other adjustments might need to be made.
I'm always amazed when I talk to students about how in tune they often are about the things that they find difficult and things that they find actually do help. They're very insightful little individuals, or large individuals.
So just to give you an idea with the tuning, so on one hand you've got curriculum. So we know that as students progress, for example, in the math curriculum, it becomes even more complex because basic skills, for example, addition, subtraction, multiplication, now have to be applied to more complex types of problems when you are into intermediate settings. In the classroom, you could have differences in how the seating arrangements are. Teacher knowledge could be in terms of the types of accommodations that they're typically used, for example, and ones that also they're familiar with, and also types of pedagogy. So, for example, some teachers may, use more of one type of approach than another. Maybe there's more of an emphasis on collaborative learning in one classroom versus another, and also different types of student engagement models. So whether they're working in one-on-one or in pairs, or there's independent work. And each of those types of contextual factors has to be taken into account, because what you're doing is you're considering those contextual factors along with the student's profile and what you know about that student's needs and their everything. So, for example, how they work in collaborative groups. What could be the barrier if they have a receptive language difficulty and they're trying to follow along in a group? So, how would you accommodate for that? So, each time the accommodation is used and it's a new setting, you're really trying to tune that accommodation to that setting, given the student's needs.
Right. So if I go back to so if we go back to that grade 4 student again, in grade 4, because of his decoding difficulties, he's unable to do the worksheet that's given. So maybe the teacher's pedagogy is, we're doing collaborative learning in the class. So the accommodation then really becomes a peer reader. One of his peers is a stronger reader, and ahead of time it's worked out that this student will do the majority of the reading for their small group. That way it's a bypass, the student continues to engage. However, as the student gets older and let's say the grade 7 teacher doesn't have the same pedagogy and again a worksheet is given, well, at this time maybe text-to-speech is more appropriate for that student because now they can engage in the work. But then we go, well, that student actually is seeing that text-to-speech, that assistive technology is kind of being found in my research is what we call the flag of stupidity. It's signaling me out. I don't want to use something that other individuals are using. So my engagement might be very low when it comes to using this technology. So again, I'm going to have to tune my accommodations. So maybe instead of using an audio recording or providing the student the work ahead of time so they could use their text-to-speech when other students aren't seeing them, so that they again can engage within the process. So again, it's just not, just having a list of accommodations doesn't necessarily give us enough information. It is that ongoing experimentation and
seeking
perspectives.
Exactly. What's the perspective of the student and also the teacher? Like really knowing, how is this going to work given my context, given my classroom, and together, very much a collaborative effort to make sure that the student is able to, for example, in this case, access the text.
And one thing we've often talked about is it wouldn't be great to have, after the IEP, have an explanation for what are all these accommodations, and then have like a teacher's log of some sort, where teachers actually are providing feedback to the next teacher so that they can see what has worked for the student and what hasn't worked.
And eventually, this is kind of extending this into the secondary system, but we know that when students with a learning disability are going on to post-secondary education, they become their own advocates.
Right.
So in secondary school, it's also helping the youth become an advocate for what they need. And that whole process of self-determination and self-advocacy is something that can be also embedded in the transition plan.
Yeah. So when we look at, so when we look at student engagement too, is the idea that there's a lot more that takes place than just necessarily or around a student's kind of willingness or not willingness to do the work. So again, level of challenge, maybe the work is too difficult, and the accommodation that we're providing them is also challenging because they have not necessarily figured out how to use it. So I'll just use text-to-speech here as an example. Often I say that students are provided a computer to read out loud to them, and they're given that, a couple of days before they have to do a test, and they're said, hey, use this computer to read the test questions out loud to you, and it becomes too overwhelming because they haven't had sufficient challenge.
Well, it's like everything else. You need practice.
Yeah. So that's a big one. Academic self-concept, the way that I view myself as a learner, is really important. I'll talk about more of that in a second. General mental health, anxiety, and depression have huge impacts on an individual's ability to learn information. If I feel very anxious about it, then my executive functioning and working memory capacity is quite low. So I literally just can't take in information because I am feeling too anxious. As well as the idea of purpose. Why am I actually doing this? So there's a lot of things that hit on student engagement. In terms of the LD population, again, we often see this academic self-concept as being one of these major things that often gets in the area of engagement.
So in a meta-analysis that was conducted looking at students with LD versus non-LD students and focusing on self-concept, they found that the students with LD tended to have lower perceptions of their, they reported lower levels of self-concept. And you can see the numbers, like particularly in academics, so 89% versus 20% in the social domain. So you can see that this ability to be, to look at yourself in particularly in academic domain and have very positive feelings are something that many students with LD seem to be struggling with.
Yeah, and so you go, okay, so if I view myself as a bad student because I have all this evidence I can't learn, and now you're telling me to do something differently, here's this accommodation that is going to help you, then they just might not buy into that. And so therefore it does take some tuning. It does take some gradual training around that accommodation so that the student begins to see the purposes of it and also begins to see how it begins to actually impact them.
And actually, so just before this, the other thing is that when we think of how to help a student understand whether or not something's working for them, part of it is we have to help them attribute, to look at why, like if they used it, what happened? Were they more successful? Did the task seem easier or more difficult? And so part of this is really, we know that feedback is a critical component of learning. And so we can foster self-reflective feedback as well as look at external objective feedback. Like, for example, how did you do on that test?
And part of that is this kind of idea of actually taking them through a process of learning a new accommodation or learning how to use a certain learning strategy. And this has kind of been modified from Graham's work on
self-regulated.
Thank you. That's what I was yes. And the whole idea is, at first, when introducing a new accommodation or a new learning strategy, we have to develop the background knowledge. Why is this important for you as a student to use this accommodation? One of the things that I always find amazing, especially around test accommodations for high school students, is their willingness not to go down to the special ed room to take their tests. Because again, they don't want to look different. There's a sense of wanting to be the same that gets in there, or a sense of, oh, if I do that, then it's some form of cheating. So it's really helping them sit down and talk about that learning profile. Here's your learning profile, and here are the things that, why this accommodation really works for you. So then you discuss it, you model it, you help them memorize the steps involved in doing the accommodation or learning strategy. You support them as they're actually doing it, and that's what Rhonda was saying, is this idea of immediate feedback has to be happening so that they understand what's going on, as well as this idea of a student being able to self-reflect on their own performance and being able to say, yes, this helped or didn't help, and then also in time will lead to independent performance.
And just as an aside, that list of strategies is also shown with the references in the bottom. When we think of, we're not just supporting their content knowledge or, like we have to think about part of learning is having good academic enablers, being able to have the metacognitive and the cognitive strategies to say, I have to, let's say, study for this test. what's a strategy I can use, why would I use it, how is it important, and the same thing, this is
Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties. We're in the midst of resolving it. Just one moment, please.
through inquiry, and another teacher is teaching it through a mix of problem-solving tasks and seat work. Each of those different scenarios could affect how the type of accommodation that might be provided and the type of support that might be needed. For example, also the science. In one class, much of science is taken through kind of using research to look at online and print resources, to be an inquiry.
Todd, Rhonda.
Yes.
We lost you for a while, so would you mind backing up a bit?
Oh, okay. So how long have we been gone for?
Okay, I remember seeing the slide.
Okay. Did you hear us talk about the slide?
Just at the end.
Oh.
So you just lost us at the end of it.
Exactly,
so
yes.
Okay, so the summary of this is that for students who often use an accommodation, we have to first help them know why it's important to them. We have to be able to model it successfully to them, and we also have to ensure that they are getting feedback around the use of that accommodation, so they need to actually see growth in their own ability. And the resulting of that is that it will finally have, they will start to internalize that and start to use that accommodation on their own, which will have a byproduct of actually impacting the student's academic self-concept. So if I do something differently and that results in me actually doing better on that task, then I'm more likely to do that again in the future. And that's also going to make me feel good about myself. And the main thing that, why this is really important is because it is the teaching of the accommodations, and it's the teaching of the learning strategies that are going to be essential for these students who have learning disabilities to not only exceed in school, in high school or elementary high school, but also in post-secondary education and out in the workforce as well. So it's really important to help to develop the sense of I need to seek out accommodations and experiment with accommodations and to find the ones that are going to work for me, so that later in life I have that skill set that I can fall back on when things get a little bit more challenging.
So very briefly, we have two different scenarios, and they just illustrate that teachers may teach the same subjects in slightly different ways. And so, for example, in scenario one, science is being taught where there's considerable amounts of note-taking and research that the student is undertaking using online and print resources. In the second scenario, science is being taught using a textbook with lectures and independent projects. They have different demands for self-regulation. They have different demands for independent work in terms of having to acquire information from a print source. And so the accommodations in each may be the same for the most part, but there might be some unique ones because the classroom context varies.
So in terms of environment then, one of the big things that we often see is, you know, a student should have appropriate, or so not appropriate seating, but preferential seating. I remember one student that I just was working with, he had preferential seating. They interpreted that he could choose where he wanted to sit. The student had severe executive function difficulties, which meant he was very disorganized. And where he decided to sit in the class was the very back row at the desk beside the door to the room, because he liked being able to monitor what was going on outside. So as he sat there, he was very distracted. But one of the comments from the teacher was he was never getting any of his work done. He never wrote down, he never handed in any of the homework. He always seemed to not know when tests were. And when talking about him, he goes, well, I can't even see the blackboard for where I'm sitting because there's a pillar in the way. So we're like, oh, so clearly just allowing the students to choose their seat was not a very good solution because they chose very poorly.
And so preferential seating actually in the research has been shown to be one of the more ambiguous accommodations. So it's important to really be specific about what that means if you're choosing that as an environmental accommodation, and then asking the students about what they find most helpful. It's still important because it could be that some students are more sensitive to noise than others. Some students are more sensitive to they would prefer to be close, and also it's your feedback. So if you find that with a younger student that when they're sitting closer and they can get more immediate feedback from you, that is proving to be a helpful thing, then that's good to communicate and explain that's the rationale for why this seating change has been made.
Yeah. So again, we need a lot more in the IEP sometimes than just simply stating what it is. And again, most of the stuff, when we look at assessment, comes to bear as well.
So when we look at what we're measuring, it's an interesting thing because as a researcher, we discuss this all the time because we know that if we give a measure, we give an assessment, it's actually measuring a bunch of things other than what we want. So essentially there's the true knowledge it's measuring, and then it's all the other things that could be going on. For example, how much effort someone puts into it. If this is a math test, whether they wrote the answer down correctly, whether they processed, they made a processing error, and so they accidentally didn't put down what they thought they put down, or they made an error in terms of how they took in the information, and so they answered the problem but not the problem that was written. And so some of these things, not all of them, are ones that we can change, and so they are closer to get at the true knowledge of the student with their assessment score than the knowledge that's actually, for example, if you measured math problem solving with a student who had significant word reading difficulties, chances are that that score is going to be heavily influenced by the barrier of not being able to read the words, or for example, they have vocabulary problems, rather than their ability to solve math problems. And so that's what we really have to look at when we're thinking of assessment accommodations. So we have to consider the test, and this I think was a wonderful contribution from Ketterland, Geller, and Crawford, where they were doing a study looking at how to help understand, the types of accommodations that students can receive. So, for example, they basically said that you need to ask three things. What are the demands of the test? What are the skills being tested? And then what skills are needed to show knowledge of the skills? So, for example, the first column has every big skill that a math problem might require. The student has to read it. They have to actually understand the words in the text. They have to retrieve the steps to solve the math problem. They have to actually understand the concept of the math problem and then, explain what the results are, and then somehow communicate their answer, whether it's by, writing it down or sharing it orally. But the only thing that's being actually tested in this particular, what the teacher wants to know is, do they understand the concept and can they explain the results? Everything else is an access point. The ability to read the words, understand the vocabulary, are things that we can accommodate for because they're not the target skill that's being assessed. And I think this was a really useful way that these authors described how to kind of go through this process. So the first step, if you're kind of wondering, oh, what can I do, is to make a list of the task analysis, to look at the task, and then figure out, circle which are the ones that I really want to assess and do it, and then what are the ones that the student might not show their knowledge because these particular prerequisite skills aren't solid.
Right. And then what happens is over time, what the prerequisite or what you're actually targeting might change, or definitely will change based on what the curriculum is asking. So, in grade 3, teaching multiplication is the main thing that you're targeting. So therefore, you wouldn't use a calculator or a multiplication table to be able to assess. Because that. Yeah, because that accommodation would basically cancel out what you're actually trying to test. However, in grade 6, when they're doing, I don't know, fractions or something, and they still need to know multiplication, well now, if the student still does not know their multiplication tables, well that is just a processing difficulty. So it, again, becomes an access. We're not necessarily measuring their ability to do the fractions. What we're actually measuring is their ability to do multiplication. So at that time, the recommendation around a calculator or a multiplication chart might be very helpful.
Right, because they can use that to show their knowledge of fractions.
Fractions, exactly, as they move on. And then the other big one that I often find is especially students who have retrieval difficulties, especially auditory sequential memory weaknesses in retrieval there, is formulas are very problematic. So in secondary school, getting reference sheets to those formulas is very beneficial for those individuals because, again, it's what we're trying to get at is, do you know what's the right formula to use? Do you know how to implement that formula to be able to solve a problem? Not can you memorize stuff?
Yeah. So actually, we kind of talked a little bit about this, but the thing is that you're looking at in executive function difficulties. So executive function are basically things like working memory, inhibitory control, the types of things that help you do goal-directed behavior. And it's often associated with problems with attention control, so the student might make a lot of careless errors or forget the formulas or miss keywords in questions. And so then you think, okay, what accommodations does this particular child need to reduce the impact of the EF difficulties on their math? There might be a prompt to check for mistakes. Mm-hmm. There might be a list of formulas that the student would, like as you said, choose. If they're missing keywords, they could be taught a strategy to help them identify the keywords in questions, maybe highlight them, and so that kind of limits the, or actually, for some students, it might be important for the teacher just to underline a keyword, mm-hmm. because it depends on whether you're assessing their ability to pick out the keywords or to solve the problem. Right. So common issues with accommodations, we've talked about ambiguous mm-hmm. wording, so you really want to be clear about what it is. Whether it actually targets the student needs. So if a student actually has problems with math problem solving because of issues with their conceptual understanding of math and problem solving, giving a calculator or having multiplication table wouldn't necessarily be the type of accommodation mm-hmm. you want to give. And that's why on that diagram where the map, math is another area where you can really break it down into, is it a computation skill, is it a more conceptual issue, is it problem solving, is it fluency versus accuracy, and all of those things have slightly different implications for how you would accommodate. Right. You might have too few provided, they're not well linked, so for example, you'd want to make sure that any instructional and assessment accommodations are connected so that you're not giving one but they can't really learn because they never held that as part of learning or vice right. versa. And I think that one of the bigger ones is not considering what the goal of the assessment is. So the question of, well, can I give this accommodation on this assessment? The first thing you have to ask is, what am I actually trying to assess? And then the final one is whether monitoring of effectiveness. So we know that accommodations can be looked at in various ways. So for example, with and without the accommodation, do you see a change in performance? With and without accommodation, does the student find it easier or more difficult to mm-hmm. complete the task? Do they complete them more often? Do they get their homework done where they have the accommodations? And so those are all questions that can be asked to make sure that you're over time, you're selecting with the student the accommodations that are most effective and most useful for that student.
Mm-hmm. And that you're tuning that to be able to really ensure that it is meeting the needs of the student. So that's accommodations. And the other area that we'll talk about very briefly is the area of modification. And again, I really stress that when we talk about modification, really the image that needs to be in our mind is of a really good remediation program that's going to take place. So in that, we really have to specify what is the skill set, what is their academic skill weakness that we are going to hone in and be able to target. Because we do have a lot of really good evidence-based remediation programs out there, but different programs target different specific skills. So it's important to kind of review what are our evidence-based remediation programs out there, what is the skill weakness that that student has so that we can make that best fit. And in the area of literacy, things such as the Florida Center for Reading, Power Up, Balanced Literacy Diet, IRIS, there are a lot of really good websites and resources out there that we can be able to access to be able to find out what we need to do to be able to target. So we need to first identify what the specific weakness is. We have to then get that program that's going to target that specific area. And then we really need to continue to assess our growth of that skill. It's not good enough just to say, okay, now we're going to do this for the next 4 or 5 months. We really have to go in and continuously monitor that skill development, because we need to know, is what we're providing actually working, or is it not? And one thing that we can use is what we call curriculum baseline measures. And if you Google curriculum baseline measures, you can often find a lot of them. Dibbles, what was that one website you showed? Easy CEM. There's a lot of good websites out there that kind of have curriculum baseline measures. And the way that curriculum baseline measure works is it's often like kind of a 1-minute snapshot of a specific academic skill. And the reason that we're going to give these snapshots on a regular basis is to try and measure growth. So we have 2 students here. We always do a baseline before we start off our specific intervention to be able to see what is their current performance. So if we look at number of words read correctly in a minute, might be a measure that we're doing to look at fluency. And we can see they're very low. We start our intervention, and then over time what we see is for child 1, oh, there's really no development happening here, so we change our intervention. We look at the intervention protocol, and we tweak that protocol to be able to maybe increase the intensity or the specificity, and then so we do that, and oh wow, we've got some new gains happening. The students now finally moving, and again we might have to change it to get in more gains to continue to increase. Child 2, right from the beginning, starts to make some good gains. We say, hey, can we get some even better gains? We tweak the protocol a bit. Well, we're getting better gains, tweak it again, and we see even more amazing gains over time. So we're constantly getting information back from the student to be able to assess, is it working? Because we might see a student completely flatlining, and that might be because either A, I as a teacher am doing something wrong, or B, this is the wrong intervention for the student. So, and I want to get that information sooner than later, so I don't let the poor student sit there for the next 6 months, not actually seeing a lot of skill development.
And actually, even when you're doing, like we've just done a study like this, and it turned out that it was really minor tweaks that really made the difference. It was, for example, how much repetition or cumulative review was being provided, or, for example, certain skills weren't being mastered, and so if we kept on going on that path, then it got more and more frustrating because the baseline, the prerequisite skills weren't there. So there was innovative ways to think, okay, can we play a game? Can we do this? Can we do that? All targeting the same skill, but to keep that student having enough practice. So some students are going to need more practice, but again, it's not like you're just sitting there giving them worksheet after worksheet. It's like thinking about how can I have this student, either review these skills and then teach a new skill and move forward. And these are all kind of, when we think of core principles, it's explicit, it's targeting the skill that's needed.
We apologize for the technical difficulties once again. We are working to resolve this as soon as possible.
going to do in each term, how are you going to teach it, and the assessment method. So we're basically just talking about how different elements of a modified program.
Rhonda,
Yes?
we lost you again at the student monitoring slide.
Okay, so maybe.
How much did you get of that?
Well, I think we got towards the end of it.
Okay,
well,
so let's just jump on to this section then.
Yeah,
Perfect.
so at this point, we're just going to finish up with an example of the second part of an IEP for many students is the modifications. And if we take a modified program, we have to state what the annual program goal is first. So for example, in this case, we would want the student who's working at a grade 3 level by the end of the year to be moving up. And we might have a fairly reasonable goal of that they're able to read grade 4 text at an independent level with accuracy and fluency. And then we're giving a specific benchmark in terms of a curriculum-based measure because we know that corresponds to the normative rate that would be expected by the end of grade 4. Then to reach that goal, we've identified learning expectations. So for example, they're going to, in first term, read grade 4 level passages at 94 words per minute, which is a fall benchmark. And how we're going to get there is we look at research like the papers by Rupley and colleagues and the review on by Boardman and colleagues on effective instruction for adolescents, which is actually grades 4 to 12. And we know that we have to be explicit about how to decode words. We have to think about what they know about phonics, letter-sound correspondences, word analysis, syllable types, and whether they can recognize high-frequency prefixes and suffixes, because that's what's been shown to make a difference. And then to help with fluency, we want repeated reading of grade 3 level text because we want them to be at a more comfortable level to get their fluency up. And then gradually, as we move into the second term, we're still teaching the same strategies, but we have higher expectations for the type of text the student is working on, and we're going to continue to work at an independent level to build fluency. And then our assessment method, we've specified that we'll be using, in this case, a curriculum-based measure of reading, but it could be another type of assessment. And the core thing is that you're actually specifying growth. You're moving the student. We want them to try to catch up. And we're using explicit or evidence-based. In this case, we know that explicit instruction in these types of things is what will work to meet that goal.
So in the end, it really comes back to this idea we have to know the student. We have to know where those specific key areas of weaknesses are so we can specifically develop intervention either through accommodation or through remediation to specifically target that goal and then be able to tailor that to the demands of both the classroom, the student, and the environment that they're hitting.
Which is essentially what Dr. Hutchinson talks about. I find that this is so helpful. You're accounting for the students' strengths and needs. You're thinking about the classroom and how it's set up and the kind of context it is. You're creating then the program for the student that includes the adaptations, so in this case it would be accommodations from the IEP, as well as potential modifications if you're catching up for many kids. And you're considering multiple points of view, including the students. How is this working for the student, especially in secondary school? Because you have to think about, well, what will help them be more, how will they advocate, how will they consider the use of this accommodation in terms of, stigma, etc. And then you have to make sure that you actually teach the accommodations to the students and then figure out, does it work and does it match everyone's needs?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Martinussen, for presenting such an interesting topic to us all today. Well, thank you for your patience as well while we were having some technical difficulties. So if anyone has any questions, please click the raise hand button on your control panel or type your question into the chat box on your dashboard. So we do have one question here. So I'll provide some context. So the biggest issue at the high school I work for is students who have IEPs and not wanting to work with the learning support teacher and or student support. student support teacher because they would be seen as different due to certain stigmas. They are reluctant to use assistive technology that would definitely support their achievement. How do we get students comfortable with their exceptionality so that they take advantage of their supports?
Idea of the students. So this goes back to the idea of the student's academic self-concept. And when academic skills self-concept is very low, then students are very reluctant to do anything that is seen as being different than what their peers are doing. And so a lot of that is working with the student to first understand their learning profile and work through with them what are, more than just saying I look different or I just don't want to do it, but really get a good understanding of why they don't want to do that accommodation. So first you have to help them understand their strengths and weaknesses, because often these students don't recognize that they have any strengths. As many times I work with a lot of learning disabled students who just say that they're stupid, when in fact you have to go through the definition saying, no, you're actually average above average. And if I actually showed you on the normal curve where you're actually doing really well in terms of your overall intelligence. So it's really helping first to build up those students' strengths or knowledge about what those strengths are, so that that you can start to get some buy-in. They have to realize that there is something that they're able to do. Then it is providing them that knowledge about why the specific accommodation is important. And often what I do is I just limit it to one accommodation. You know, when a student's not willing to buy in, I don't try and give them tons of accommodations. We just go to one. We just try and get them to buy into one accommodation. And that accommodation often addresses what is the most, what area of school is most challenging for you at this time. So have the student identify what is the area that's most challenging for you at this time, and again, teachers going to help kind of guide that conversation a bit. Once that's identified, then we kind of work together to come up with what is the accommodation that's going to help. Again, sometimes by just telling the student what to do, they're not likely to do it. But if you involve them in an ongoing discussion of, where they can give input about what that accommodation should be, then they often show more invested interest into actually trying that. And this is something that doesn't happen in one evening. It's often multiple conversations with the student to help to get them to buy in and really to focus in on what that first accommodation is going to be. And if they have success on that accommodation, then it's likely that they'll try one more. And then it grows.
Okay, great. So there's a more general question here. So which students require an IEP?
Unmuted. Well, usually so formally, the Ministry of Education, we review their documents. They talk about individualized education plans they must be prepared for students who have been formally identified as exceptional according to an IPRC. So when the IPRC is done, the IPRC committee identifies the student as exceptional and recommends a placement. And then from that, the IEP is developed. But there are also a number of students who have received an IEP who have not been formally identified, but they are showing challenges that that could be supported with accommodations, and in that case, an IEP would be provided as well.
Again, I really see the IEP as kind of a bit of the manual or list of instructions of what is needed kind of to start to support the student. And the idea is, you know, if one teacher is having some difficulties with identifying some challenges students have, they develop some ideas, why not put that into the IEP so then the next year the next teacher can get those ideas and start immediately starting to support that student where the last teacher that left off. So for me, I think IEPs are great. They should be a communication tool that allows for teacher after teacher after teacher to see what is working so that this student can be learning at their optimal level within my classroom. And again, it should be a living document. It should be continuously being updated and changed as the next teacher kind of sees what has worked and what hasn't worked for them.
Okay, great. Now we have someone who will ask you personally. We have a question from Nicole Pereira.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm just curious, so I have a daughter, she's 7. She went through an education assessment through a psychologist. She was deemed to have a learning disability in memory retention, primarily from putting it to working memory to long-term memory. She just has difficulties with symbolic recognition, so the letters, the numbers, and obviously building them out into then her words and her sentences, and struggles with the reading piece of it. Originally, we assumed that it was potentially to do with her age. She was a premature baby. She did do speech therapy. She went through some developmental stages, and she's the December 31st baby, so she's the youngest child in the classroom as well. So we weren't sure whether it was a maturity thing and she just needed to catch up on what she was learning. But overall, I guess, now we're at the stage we've brought forth, because we went through the process of going through the assessment. It wasn't at a time yet when the school would fund it for you, because I guess it needed to get to a certain age, and she's really only ending now grade 2 as it is. I guess, what responsibility do they have to installing an IEP and kind of following through with it from an education standpoint? Most specifically, they're following, they recommended modification, and necessarily seems a little bit reluctant in doing so. And what, I guess, for me, where, if you have any suggested resources for me to use, because I'm not confident that it's going to be able to give her enough support for what I want, and is there any tutoring sessions outside of this, or organizations that you might suggest that we use outside of the school system?
So there's a lot there, and not being able to give very specific recommendations without seeing a lot of other the assessment details. I guess the thing to say is any parent can, once you have a reasonable understanding that there's some concerns, especially if you have an assessment, is you can write your school principal and ask for an IPRC meeting, an individual placement and review committee meeting. And that begins a process where the school has to then respond and has to set up that meeting. So that's your kind of your ticket into the door to start to get the people around the table to help generate some ideas. And out of that, especially if you have the assessment complete at that point, out of that will come some recommendations. And if your child is recognized as an exceptional student, then they must develop the IEP at that point. So if there is a reluctance to just start the IEP process, then your mechanism to ensure that that starts up is that, like, writing in and requesting the IPRC meeting. Outside of that, then, you know, in terms of tutors and stuff like that, it depends where you are.
Right. Like, there are a number of different organizations, but I think that would be something that probably the LPAO,
chapter for your area
can help you with.
Mm-hmm. And then other sites like the Balanced Literacy Diet website's really good around literacy stuff. You know, I think as the development of the LD at School website comes up, you know, we're going to see more and more resources there that are going to guide you places. But often your local LDAO chapter is a good place to start. And if you're working with a psychologist, asking the psychologist, you know, what resources do they know for your community?
Great. Thank you. We have another question here. We are excited about creating student profiles for students with IEPs. How quickly can we get a copy of the profile map?
As fast as the organizers today can send it out. Or the other place you can grab it, if you want to grab it today offline, if you go to learndifferent.org, so learndifferent as one word.org, there is a copy of it sitting there.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask one last question. So I teach students with LDs in grade 9 and 10 who have issues with self-esteem, self-regulation, and self-advocacy. How would I involve them in setting IEP objectives for the social-emotional areas?
Well, I think I think, again, with that age group, you're working with the youth to help them reflect on what it is they want, and part of what, you know, they're going to buy into those social emotional objectives if they understand why they're important, and you know, what if they meet them, how that's going to help them out. Yeah. So I think it's really having a conversation with the students, and again, as Todd said earlier, it's not exactly a fast process, but it's starting off also small, saying, okay, what's one thing that we can work on? What do you think would be really helpful? And then let's plan it together.
Yeah. And yeah, it's that ongoing conversation, because again, most often what I find when we provide accommodations to the student, we tell them, well, you should go down and write your test in Mrs. Lee's class because it's a special ed room. And there's not a discussion about why that is actually going to be beneficial to them. And so therefore they go, no, I don't want to do that because, hey, I don't want Mrs. Silly getting up and leaving the classroom to do that. So it's backing up and really providing what we call, you know, that kind of psychoeducational psychoeducation around for that student, helping them understand their learning profile, helping them understand why this is important for them, and then ensuring, and this is really important, when they do buy into the accommodation, ensuring that that accommodation results in some success. Because if you give accommodation and it doesn't work, then the likelihood they're going to come back again to try it is very low. So it's really important to make sure that you're intervening a bit to ensure that that accommodation is made.
And like some of my work focuses on youth with ADHD, and so from a self-regulation and kind of self-advocacy perspective, and that was kind of caught, so I'm kind of guesstimating that that's what. So part of it is also helping them deal with the self-regulation demands by thinking about, for example, if it's organization, you know, here are approaches that you can use, and we're going to, like, there might be a checklist, but I'm going to help you with the first week use it, and then gradually you're going to use it. So we can still do kind of the gradual release of responsibility model, even though the students are older, but in a more kind of, you know, co-supportive way, rather than I'm just checking up on you, to help them see that if they're engaging in this type of self-regulation, maybe, and they're using, let's say, a certain tool or a certain strategy, that's going to result in, let's say, having, you know, better marks because their homework was turned in time, or their project got done, or it's even sitting down and saying, okay, you've got a project. This is a real challenge for many people, so let's break it down into some of the steps. How long do you think it'll take you to do this? So what happens if we put that deadline and you come chat to me? So it's really kind of trying to integrate those two things, the metacognitive, the kind of the overarching self-regulation piece, with also the more maybe specific accommodation around assistive technology, for example.
Yeah. And then the whole idea of gradual release of responsibility to the student, which is really needed.
And I hope that helps.
Yes, great answer. All right. Okay. That's all the time we have for today. We're going to end our question and answer session at this time. If you have any further questions, please email us at info@ld@school.ca, and we will ensure all of your questions get answered. Before you go, I have a brief message from the LD at School team. It is with great pride that we present the first annual Educators Institute on Demystifying Learning Disabilities in the Classroom. As a delegate attending the Educators Institute, you will be provided with new perspectives and knowledge in the field of LDs based on current research and practical information on effective assessment and instructional strategies, including technology. All Ontario educators who work hands-on with students with LDs are encouraged to attend. For more information about this event, please visit our event website using the link displayed on this slide. Don't forget to take advantage of the early bird pricing, which ends on May 31st. If you would like to be kept up to date about our events, such as our free webinars, please subscribe to LD at School's bi-weekly newsletter. You can do this on the LD at School homepage by entering your email in the sign-up box located on the bottom of the page. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Martinussen for their presentations. And I'd also like to thank all of our participants for joining us. Don't forget that we will be sending out presentation slides, as well as a short survey following today's webinar. We would really appreciate your taking the time to fill out the survey so we can use this information when conducting future webinars. Also, remember that we will be sending out a link to this recorded webinar in approximately 2 weeks. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.